The sky rips apart in fire, metal screams. Boys are thrown from the clouds into an ocean that does not care if they live or drown. When the smoke clears, there is only silence and an island. Palm trees sway like nothing happened. White sand, blue water. Paradise. Except it isn't. Because there are no adults, no rules, no one coming. At least not yet. A choir boy named Jack steps out of the jungle, shoes still polished, voice sharp with authority. And then there's Ralph, sun-haired, stunned but steady, clutching a strange shell pulled from the shore. A conch. When he blows it, the sound rolls across the island, calling the scattered survivors together. They gather, frightened, hopeful. But one small boy whispers about a beast in the trees. And something in the forest moves. Ralph holds the conch tighter now, like it's the only solid thing in a world that just fell from the sky. The boys listen when he speaks. That matters. Order matters. They vote him chief, and for a moment, it feels like civilization survived the crash. But Jack's smile doesn't reach his eyes. He wanted control. You can see it in the way his jaw tightens, the way his fingers curl around the knife at his belt. Still, he nods. Offers hunters, promises meat. The island suddenly has roles: leader, choir, hunters. A fragile system built on sand. They explore. The jungle breathes heat and rot. Vines claw at their legs. Somewhere deep inside, pigs scatter through undergrowth, wild and fast. Jack raises his knife for the first time and hesitates. The animal escapes. He laughs it off, but his face burns red. "I'll get one," he mutters. "Next time." Days pass. A signal fire is built high on the mountain. Smoke means rescue. It has to. The boys cheer as flames climb into the sky. For a heartbeat, hope feels real, almost close enough to touch. Then the wind shifts. The fire spreads, hungry and reckless, devouring trees, roaring louder than their excitement. The little boy with the birthmark, the one who spoke of the beast, screams as smoke swallows the hillside. And when the flames finally die, he's gone. Silence. No one says it out loud, but they all feel it. The island isn't playing with them anymore. Night presses in differently now. The fire's ashes still cling to the mountain, a black scar against the moonlight, and no one mentions the boy with the birthmark. They just don't look at that part of the forest anymore. But the silence around his name is louder than any scream. Ralph tries to hold meetings. He lifts the conch. His voice cracks as he talks about shelters, about keeping the signal fire steady this time. "We need rules," he insists. His hands tremble, but he doesn't let them see. Not much. Because if he falls apart, everything does. Jack doesn't argue. Not directly. Instead, he slips into the trees with his hunters. Faces smeared in clay now, red and white stripes like war paint. It changes them, hides them. The jungle smells different when you're painted. Sweat, mud, blood waiting to happen. Sweat, mud, blood waiting to happen. The first kill is messy. The pig's squeal splits the air, high and human, and for a second Jack freezes again. Then something snaps inside him. The knife comes down. Again. Again. Warm blood coats his hands. The boys around him start shouting. Wild, breathless, alive in a way they weren't before. They drag the carcass back like a trophy. Meanwhile, the signal fire dies. Smoke thins into nothing. A ship passes on the horizon. So close, it feels cruel. Ralph sees it. He runs up the mountain, heart hammering. Nothing. No flame. No smoke. When Jack returns, grinning, face streaked and eyes bright with triumph, Ralph hits him. Hard. You let the fire go out. Jack barely feels it. He's still buzzing from the hunt. "We got meat," he says, like that answers everything. But here's the thing. It does. The other boys stare at the pig. At the blood. At Jack. Their stomachs growl louder than their loyalty. And that night, as they feast and chant around the fire, a new sound rises from the forest. Not the wind. Breathing. The chanting doesn't stop when the meat is gone. It lingers in their throats, in their chests, in the rhythm of their feet stomping sand into dust. Kill the pig. Cut her throat. Spill her blood. Over and over until it doesn't even sound like words anymore, just hunger given a voice. Ralph stands at the edge of the firelight, the conch tucked under his arm like something fragile and old. He watches Jack in the glow of the flames. There's a new confidence in him now. A dangerous one. Power tastes better than pork. And then the little ones start crying again. They swear they've seen it. The beast. Moving between trees. Watching. Breathing. One of them claims glowing eyes. Another says it crawls on all fours. Fear spreads fast in the dark. Faster than truth. Ralph calls an assembly. His voice fights the wind. There is no beast, he says. We're the only ones here. He needs that to be true. He needs the island to make sense. But Jack steps forward, painted face cracked with dried blood. What if there is? He challenges softly, not yelling, just planting doubt. Maybe it hunts us. The air shifts. Boys who once laughed now glance over shoulders. The jungle suddenly feels closer, thicker, alive. So they climb the mountain to prove it. Night. Wind howling. The dead fire pit crouches like a grave. And there, at the top, something moves. A shape. Huge. Twisted. Rising and falling like it's breathing. Ralph's heart slams so hard he feels it in his teeth. Jack steps closer. Brave. Or pretending to be. The shape jerks violently in the wind. And then they run. Down the mountain. Through the dark. No one speaks of what they saw. They don't need to. Because now the beast is real. And it's waiting. By morning, the island feels smaller. The boys don't talk about what they saw on the mountain. They don't have to. It lives behind their eyes now. Every snapped twig becomes a warning. Every gust of wind feels like breath on the back of the neck. Ralph clutches the conch during assembly, knuckles white. We saw something, he admits. The words taste like failure. Leaders aren't supposed to be afraid. But we still need the fire. Jack laughs, not loud, worse calm. The beast doesn't care about your fire. He steps forward, face painted again, the mask already half swallowed by his skin. It wants blood. And just like that, the meeting fractures. Jack doesn't ask for permission. He simply turns and walks away, hunters following without hesitation, one by one, until Ralph is left staring at the backs of boys who used to wait for him to speak. The split is clean, brutal. Jack's tribe builds their camp at the far end of the island, near the rocks shaped like broken teeth. They sharpen sticks at both ends now. They hunt not just for food, but for something else, something darker. The next pig they kill isn't eaten right away. Jack orders its head cut off. Flies swarm instantly, thick and buzzing. The smell hits hard sweet rot, metallic blood baking under the sun. They jam the severed head onto a sharpened stake and plant it in the clearing like an offering. For the beast, Jack whispers. The other boys stare at it, half horrified, half hypnotized. Meanwhile, Simon slips away alone. He's quiet. Always has been. The jungle doesn't scare him the way it scares the others. It feels honest. He walks deeper than anyone dares, until he finds the pig's head grinning at him, flies crawling through its open mouth. The air vibrates with buzzing. Simon stares at it too long. And then, the head speaks. Not with a voice. Not really. But the words fill Simon's mind, thick and oily. You knew, didn't you? It hums. I'm part of you. Simon sways, sweat dripping into his eyes. You're not real, he whispers. The flies lift and settle again. Of course I'm real. The world tilts. And somewhere beyond the trees, the wind tugs at something tangled high above the mountain. Something that isn't breathing at all. Simon runs. Branches whip across his face. Lungs burning. The pig's head laughter still echoing inside his skull. It's you, it had whispered. The beast is you. He doesn't want to believe it. He can't. But something in his chest knows. He climbs the mountain alone. Wind slams into him near the summit, cold and violent. And there, tangled in the rocks, is the shape they saw. Not claws. Not teeth. A dead parachutist, uniform torn, face eaten by birds. The parachute snaps in the wind, making the body rise and fall like it's breathing. The beast was never alive. Simon stares at the truth, trembling. All this fear. All this blood. for nothing. He frees the tangled lines gently, letting the body drift away with the wind. Then he runs back to tell them. But night has already swallowed the island. Jack's tribe dances in a storm, rain slashing sideways, firelight flickering wild across painted faces. "Kill the beast," they chant, half drunk on thunder and fear. Ralph and Piggy stand at the edge, pulled by the rhythm despite themselves. And then Simon stumbles out of the dark, mud-soaked, gasping, arms raised. "It's not," he tries to say. Lightning splits the sky. The boys see a shape bursting from the trees. They don't see Simon, they see the beast. And they fall on him. Hands. Sticks. Screams swallowed by thunder. It happens fast. Too fast. When the storm clears, Simon's body lies broken on the sand, waves already reaching for him like something gentle and ashamed. By morning, no one says his name. But something has changed. Because now, they've killed one of their own. Morning comes gray and unforgiving. The tide has erased most of the blood, but not the memory. Ralph wakes with sand stuck to his face and something heavier lodged in his chest. He remembers the circle, the chanting, the way his own voice joined in. Just for a second. It was an accident. He whispers to Piggy. Piggy's glasses catch the dull light. "We was scared," he says, but his voice shakes. Fear doesn't excuse it. They both know that. Across the island, Jack does not whisper. He stands taller now, spear in hand, power settled on his shoulders like a crown. "The beast came disguised," he tells his tribe. "We killed it." And the boys nod, because it's easier than facing the truth. Easier than admitting they tore apart one of their own. That night, Jack comes for fire. Not with words, with force. His hunters raid Ralph's camp in the dark. Screams, scuffling bodies. Piggy falls, clutching his glasses as hands rip them away. The only tool they have left to make fire gone. Without the glasses, the signal fire is impossible. Without fire, rescue fades into fantasy. Ralph stares at the empty sky the next morning. The island feels hostile now. Not because of a beast in the trees, because of the boys. Desperate, Ralph and Piggy climb to Jack's fortress of rock, determined to demand the glasses back. The sea crashes below like applause for violence waiting to happen. Roger stands above them, silent, eyes empty. A massive boulder rests beside him, balanced on a ledge. Piggy steps forward, clutching the conch. "Which is better?" he cries, voice cracking. "To have rules and agree, or to hunt and kill?" For a heartbeat, there's still a choice. Roger pushes. The boulder falls. Time slows. The conch shatters mid-air, exploding into white fragments. Piggy's body follows, striking the rocks below with a sickening finality. Silence. The last piece of civilization dies with him. Ralph runs. Through vines. Through vines. Through thorns. Through a jungle that now hunts him back. Behind him, Jack's tribe screams with one voice, painted faces twisted, spears raised. They are not boys anymore. They are hunters. And Ralph is the pig. Smoke begins to rise again, but not for rescue. For him. There's something almost poetic about the fact that Harry Hook chose to remake Lord of the Flies in 1990, at the tail end of a decade obsessed with consumerism, excess, and the illusion of control. William Golding's 1954 novel had already been adapted once in 1963 by Peter Brook, in a stark, almost documentary style. So why return to this brutal fable about civilization collapsing under the weight of its own instincts? The answer begins with Hook himself. A director who, up to that point, wasn't exactly synonymous with literary gravitas. Harry Hook came from a background that straddled British television and feature films, including The Kitchen Toto, 1987, a colonial-era drama that earned critical attention and even a Golden Globe nomination. That film revealed something important about Hook. He was interested in power structures, who holds them, who abuses them, and who gets crushed beneath them. Colonial Kenya, stranded schoolboys on an island. The settings change, but the moral question remains. What happens when authority dissolves? The 1990 Lord of the Flies wasn't just a remake, it was a reinterpretation. Hook relocated the story from British schoolboys to American military cadets, a decision that subtly but profoundly altered the thematic texture. Golding's original novel was steeped in post-war British anxiety, written by a man who had witnessed the horrors of World War II firsthand. Hook's version trades that context for a distinctly American lens: discipline, hierarchy, and military order already embedded in the boys before they even crash. It's a fascinating shift. Instead of innocence decaying into savagery, the film suggests that the seeds of aggression may have already been planted. And that's where Hook's vision becomes clear. He wasn't simply interested in survival drama. He was dissecting the myth of inherent nobility. The boys in this version aren't choir boys in neat uniforms. They're cadets, trained in obedience and command. Civilization isn't something they build from scratch. It's something they try to replicate. They elect leaders. They attempt systems. They cling to structure. And yet, it collapses anyway. That choice reframes Golding's central thesis. Savagery doesn't erupt because society is absent. It erupts because society's foundations are thinner than we want to admit. Visually and tonally, Hook steered away from Peter Brook's black-and-white austerity and leaned into the polished, sun-drenched aesthetic of late 80s and early 90s adventure cinema. Shot primarily in Jamaica, the island isn't just a backdrop, it's almost seductive. Turquoise water, lush greenery, golden light filtering through palm trees. It looks like paradise. And that's deliberate. The beauty makes the violence feel more jarring. Civilization doesn't fall in darkness, it falls in daylight. Hook's collaboration with producer Lewis M. Allen also signaled a desire to make the story more accessible to contemporary audiences. Brook's 1963 version had used non-professional actors and a near-documentary style, creating a raw but distant tone. Hook wanted emotional immediacy. He wanted audiences, especially American teens, to see themselves in these characters. The casting of recognizable young actors, like Balthazar Getty as Ralph and Chris Furrh as Jack, reinforced that goal. This wasn't an art house experiment. It was a mainstream cautionary tale. But here's the tension. Can you commercialize nihilism? Golding's novel is uncompromising in its bleakness. Hook's task was to preserve that darkness while making the film palatable to a studio-backed audience. The result is a tonal balancing act. The film doesn't shy away from brutality, especially in its later acts, but it packages the descent in a more conventional narrative rhythm. There's clearer heroism, more defined antagonism. Ralph feels like a traditional protagonist. Jack feels like a more straightforward villain. That simplification arguably sacrifices some of Golding's moral ambiguity, yet it also sharpens the emotional stakes. Hook's direction often emphasizes the fragility of order. Watch how frequently the camera lingers on symbols of authority: the conch shell, the military whistle, even makeshift shelters. These objects are framed with a kind of reverence early on. By the final act, they're either destroyed or meaningless. It's not subtle, and it's not meant to be. Hook understands that this story operates as allegory. His job isn't to obscure the message, it's to make it land. There's also a generational undercurrent worth noting. Released in 1990, the film arrived at a moment when Cold War anxieties were dissolving, but new uncertainties were emerging. The idea that young boys, future soldiers, future leaders, could devolve into tribal violence struck a nerve. Hook taps into that fear without preaching. He lets the island become a microcosm, a controlled experiment. Remove adult supervision. Add fear. Observe the results. Was Hook the obvious choice to adapt Golding again? Not necessarily. But sometimes that's precisely why it works. He approaches the material less like a literary preservationist and more like a dramatist. He trims, reshapes, and modernizes. He injects kinetic energy where Brook had favored stillness. He prioritizes emotional clarity over philosophical ambiguity. Whether that enhances or dilutes Golding's vision is a debate worth having, and we will. Because a director's vision is only the starting point, the real question becomes, how did this adaptation reshape Golding's text at the script level? What was changed, what was softened, and what was amplified for a 1990 audience. That blueprint, the writing decisions behind the camera, reveals just as much about the film's identity as Hook's direction ever could. If Harry Hook provided the interpretive lens, the screenplay determined what we were actually looking at. And adapting Lord of the Flies is no small task. William Golding's novel isn't plot-heavy in the traditional sense. It's psychological, symbolic, almost clinical in how it dissects human behavior. Turning that into a 90-minute studio film for a 1990 audience required reshaping without completely betraying the source. That tension, faithfulness versus accessibility, defines the writing choices throughout. The screenplay for the 1990 version was written by J. Preston Allen, an experienced screenwriter whose credits included the prime of Miss Jean Brodie and later Cabaret rewrites. Allen understood adaptation. She knew that translating literature to screen isn't about copying dialogue. It's about capturing thematic DNA while respecting the demands of cinema. Golding's prose lives in internal reflection. Film demands external action. So the script leans harder into confrontation, clearer conflicts, sharper character divides. The most immediate and obvious change lies in the boys themselves. Golding's original characters were British schoolchildren stranded during wartime evacuation. The 1990 film reimagines them as American military cadets escaping a plane crash. That single alteration reshapes the entire narrative foundation. These boys arrive already conditioned by hierarchy. They salute. They follow chain of command. Leadership isn't an abstract idea. They've practiced it, which makes their eventual collapse feel less like lost innocence and more like systemic failure. Think about that shift. In the novel, the tragedy is that children, left alone, invent cruelty. In Hook and Allen's version, the tragedy is that structure doesn't prevent cruelty. It masks it. Ralph isn't just the boy with a conch. He's the cadet trying to recreate order because he's been trained to believe in it. Jack isn't just a power-hungry child. He's a product of competitive masculinity, already fluent in dominance. The script sharpens this rivalry, giving it cleaner edges. Hero and antagonist become more defined. Some purists argue this simplifies Golding's moral ambiguity. They're not entirely wrong. The novel's horror partly comes from how ordinary and interchangeable the boys feel. In the film, personalities are more distinct, more cinematic. Jack's descent into savagery is more pronounced, almost theatrical. Ralph's moral center is more stable. Simon remains the spiritual outlier, but even his characterization is streamlined to fit tighter pacing. Complexity gives way to clarity, and pacing is key here. Golding's book unfolds gradually, with tension simmering over extended chapters. The film compresses that timeline. Conflicts escalate faster. Factions form quickly. The beast becomes a psychological catalyst earlier in the runtime. Cinema thrives on momentum, and Allen's script understands that hesitation can feel like stagnation on screen. The trade-off? A slightly reduced sense of creeping inevitability. The novel feels like erosion. The film feels like fracture. Dialogue also undergoes modernization. Golding's mid-20th century British phrasing wouldn't land naturally with American actors in 1990. So the script adjusts tone and cadence. Conversations feel more contemporary, less formal. There's more overt hostility, less restrained politeness. And that matters because language reflects social conditioning. When these boys argue, they don't sound like choir members. They sound like adolescents raised in competitive institutions. The verbal aggression mirrors the physical escalation. One of the more debated script decisions involves the portrayal of violence. Golding's novel is disturbing, but much of its horror lives in implication. The film must visualize events that readers once imagined. Allen and Hook walk a careful line. They don't sanitize the brutality, especially in the third act, but they stage it with a sense of narrative inevitability rather than shock exploitation. When tragedy strikes, it feels tragic, not sensational. The script builds toward those moments methodically. There's also a subtle shift in how authority is framed. In the novel, The arrival of adults at the end is deeply ironic. A naval officer scolding boys for playing war while a global war rages beyond the island. The 1990 film retains the rescue, but the broader wartime irony is less emphasized. The focus tightens on the boys' internal breakdown rather than geopolitical commentary. That narrowing reflects a more character-driven approach, trading macro allegory for emotional immediacy. Here's where the adaptation becomes fascinating. The film doesn't abandon Golding's core thesis. The beast still represents internal darkness. The conch still symbolizes fragile democracy. Fire still equals hope and destruction. But the script foregrounds interpersonal drama over philosophical meditation. It trusts performance and confrontation to carry ideas that Golding expressed through narration. Does that dilute the source, or does it translate it for a new generation? That depends on what you value more: literary fidelity or cinematic engagement. Allen's screenplay makes deliberate sacrifices. It trims abstraction. It sharpens conflict. It humanizes allegory. And in doing so, it prepares the story for something crucial: actors who can embody these tensions with physical presence and emotional immediacy. Because, on paper, Ralph and Jack are ideological opposites. On screen, they have to feel like real teenagers unraveling under pressure. And the casting process, who was chosen, who wasn't, and why, would determine whether this adaptation felt lived in or merely performed. Casting Lord of the Flies in 1990 was a gamble disguised as a necessity. You can't anchor a film about collapsing innocence with fully formed stars. The illusion would shatter instantly. These characters have to feel unpolished, impulsive, half-formed. At the same time, a studio-backed remake couldn't rely entirely on unknowns the way Peter Brook did in 1963. Harry Hook needed young actors who felt authentic but could carry emotional weight. That balance shaped every casting decision. Balthazar Getty landed the role of Ralph, the elected leader clinging to order. Getty wasn't a household name, but he wasn't invisible either. Coming from the prominent Getty family and having appeared in projects like Young Guns 2, he brought a certain natural screen presence. More importantly, he had that clean-cut, all-American look, square jaw, open expression that makes audiences instinctively trust him. Ralph needs to feel like the obvious choice for leadership. Getty embodies that without forcing it. Here's what works about his casting. He doesn't play Ralph as a saint. There's frustration simmering under his attempts at diplomacy. Watch his posture in early council scenes. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, trying to mimic adult authority. It's performative. And that's exactly right. He's a teenager imitating leadership because he thinks that's what survival demands. Getty's relative inexperience becomes an asset. You can see the strain. Opposite him stands Chris Furrh as Jack, and this is where casting sharpens the film's central conflict. Furrh doesn't have Getty's polished presence. He's wirier, edgier. His intensity feels less rehearsed and more volatile. Jack isn't charming. He's compelling in a way that makes you slightly uneasy. That imbalance between the two actors visually reinforces the ideological divide. Ralph looks like a leader. Jack looks like someone who wants to be one at any cost. The rivalry works because neither actor feels overly theatrical. Furr's performance leans into physicality. Hard stares, clenched jaws, a restless way of moving through the frame. He often occupies space like he's testing it, as if the island belongs to whoever claims it most aggressively. That physical confidence becomes narrative fuel. When Jack challenges Ralph, it's not just verbal dissent, it's territorial energy. James Badge Dale, playing Simon, adds another layer entirely. Simon is the story's moral mystic. The boy who senses the beast is internal rather than external. Casting Simon is tricky. Too ethereal, and he becomes abstract. Too grounded, and the symbolism evaporates. Dale threads that needle. His Simon feels observant rather than fragile. Quiet, yes, but not weak. There's an inward focus to his performance that contrasts beautifully with Jack's outward aggression. The younger boys, particularly the actors playing Piggy and the little ones, complete the ensemble dynamic. Danuel Pipoly's Piggy is worth pausing on. Piggy in Golding's novel is both intellectual and socially ostracized. Pipoly captures that vulnerability without turning him into caricature. His physicality, slightly awkward, often on the periphery of group compositions, makes his exclusion painfully visible. When others talk over him, you feel it, and when his ideas are dismissed, the frustration lands. Casting director involvement often goes unnoticed in analysis, but here it's crucial. The ensemble had to feel cohesive, like boys who plausibly attended the same academy. Their shared physical training, marching, drills, help sell that reality. Even in early scenes before chaos erupts, their movements are disciplined. Lines form naturally. Commands are echoed. That authenticity gives the later breakdown more weight. Order doesn't just disappear. It unravels. There's also something quietly strategic about casting mostly American actors. By shifting the nationality from British to American, the film localizes Golding's allegory. This isn't a distant moral experiment happening over there. It's happening here. In American accents, with American cadets. The cultural familiarity makes the descent more unsettling for a U.S. audience. The casting reinforces that immediacy. Chemistry tests between Getty and Furrh reportedly focused on confrontation scenes, leadership debates, moments of public dissent. You can sense that groundwork in their exchanges. They don't feel like actors delivering lines. They feel like teenagers arguing over status. And status, in adolescence, is everything. That authenticity becomes the engine of the film's escalating conflict. But casting choices only set the stage. Talent alone doesn't guarantee resonance. The real test comes when the camera lingers, when emotion must carry silence, when ideology must translate into facial tension, when fear has to flicker across young faces without dialogue spelling it out. That's where performances either transcend the script or flatten under it. And in this film, the lead performances, especially the combustible dynamic between Ralph and Jack, determine whether Golding's thesis feels theoretical or painfully real. The moment that defines Balthazar Getty's performance as Ralph doesn't come during a speech. It comes in silence. After authority begins slipping through his fingers, there's a flicker in his eyes, a recognition that the rules he believes in may not be enough. That's the emotional hinge of the character. Ralph isn't just fighting Jack, he's fighting the terrifying possibility that leadership, as he understands it, might be fragile theater. Getty plays Ralph as someone trying to hold on to structure because structure is all he knows. Early on, his posture is upright, voice measured, commands delivered with almost rehearsed certainty. He looks like he's playing the role of a cadet commander. And that's intentional. Ralph isn't naturally dominant. He's conditioned. As the island descends into chaos, Getty subtly strips away that performative confidence. His shoulders slump. His voice cracks. Leadership becomes less about authority and more about desperation. Watch the assembly scenes closely. In the beginning, Ralph stands centered in the frame, often slightly elevated, visually reinforcing control. Later, as Jack's influence grows, Ralph is pushed to the margins. The camera doesn't just capture performance, it tracks power. Getty responds to that shift physically. He starts looking over his shoulder more, pauses longer before speaking. It's not grand acting, it's incremental erosion. And that slow unraveling makes his arc believable. Chris Furrh's Jack operates on the opposite trajectory. Where Ralph weakens, Jack expands. Furrh plays him not as a cartoon villain, but as someone discovering how intoxicating dominance can feel. Early on, there's frustration. He expects authority and doesn't receive it. The disappointment simmers, jaw tight, eyes locked. Then comes the pivot. Once hunting becomes a source of validation, Jack's physicality changes. He moves with a predator's assurance. Shoulders back. Chin forward. The island becomes a stage for his ego. Here's what makes Furrh compelling. He doesn't shout his menace. He radiates it. Even in quiet moments, there's tension coiled beneath his stillness. When he challenges Ralph, it feels less like rebellion and more like inevitability. You sense that Jack was always going to push boundaries. The environment just accelerates the process. That's a crucial distinction. The performance suggests savagery isn't born on the island, it's unlocked. Their confrontations crackle because neither actor overplays the conflict. In many survival dramas, rivalries lean into melodrama. Here, the arguments feel messy and adolescent. Voices overlap. Gestures interrupt. There's immaturity in the hostility, which makes it more unsettling. These aren't seasoned tyrants. They're teenagers experimenting with power. And that experimentation spirals quickly. James Badgedale's Simon provides emotional contrast. While Ralph and Jack clash externally, Simon internalizes. Dale's performance is rooted in stillness. He often watches rather than speaks. His eyes do the heavy lifting, absorbing tension, registering fear, processing truths others avoid. In scenes where the beast mythology intensifies, Dale plays Simon not as delusional but as perceptive. He understands the threat isn't lurking in the jungle. It's standing in the clearing. There's a pivotal sequence where Simon isolates himself from the group. The camera lingers, the soundscape softens, and Dale allows vulnerability to surface without theatricality. No grand monologue, just realization. That restraint amplifies the tragedy later. His arc isn't about power, it's about insight. And insight, in this world, becomes dangerous. Danuel Pipoly's Piggy deserves special attention. Piggy is often the emotional barometer of the group, the voice of reason drowned out by louder impulses. Pipoly avoids turning him into comic relief. Yes, there's awkwardness. Yes, there's insecurity. But there's also intelligence and wounded pride. When others dismiss him, you can see humiliation flash across his face before he masks it with stubborn persistence. That layering keeps Piggy human. One of the film's strengths lies in how the ensemble interacts physically. As tribal divisions solidify, the boys cluster differently in scenes. Jack's followers huddle tightly, almost feral in their body language. Ralph's remaining allies stand more spaced out, defensive rather than unified. The actors commit to that spatial storytelling. Group identity becomes visible in posture and proximity. Here's the thing about performances anchored by young actors. Authenticity can't be faked. You either believe their fear or you don't. In this film, when chaos erupts, when chanting replaces dialogue, when painted faces blur individuality, the energy feels raw. There's unpredictability in their movements. It doesn't feel choreographed. It feels like something slipping out of control. Do the performances reach the psychological depth of Golding's prose? Not entirely. Film rarely replicates literary interiority, but what they achieve is tangible immediacy. You watch Ralph's hope fracture in real time. You watch Jack taste power and crave more. You watch Simon realize the truth too late. And that emotional clarity grounds the allegory. Yet even the strongest performances rely on support. No leader falls alone. No tyrant rises without followers. And the supporting cast, the shifting loyalties, the quieter boys choosing sides, create the social ecosystem that allows this descent to feel plausible. Because savagery isn't a solo act, it's a group decision. For a story about the collapse of civilization, the supporting cast in Lord of the Flies carries an enormous burden. It's easy to frame this narrative as Ralph versus Jack, a clean ideological duel. But societies don't fracture because of two personalities. They fracture because of crowds, because of followers, because of the quiet majority choosing sides. And that's where the ensemble becomes essential. Take the character of Piggy again, but this time in relation to the group dynamic rather than as an isolated performance. Danuel Pipoly's portrayal gains power precisely because of how others respond to him. The dismissive glances, the interrupted sentences, the casual cruelty. Piggy's marginalization isn't loud, it's systemic. No one boy destroys his authority. The group erodes it collectively. That social realism is uncomfortable because it mirrors real adolescent hierarchies. Intelligence without physical dominance becomes liability. Then there's Roger, played by Gary Rule. a character who often slips under the radar in casual discussion, but is crucial to the story's moral descent. Roger doesn't posture like Jack. He doesn't debate like Ralph. He observes. And when he acts, he does so with chilling detachment. Rule plays him with minimal expression, which makes his moments of violence more unsettling. There's no visible internal conflict, no hesitation, just execution. Savagery here isn't emotional, it's clinical. Roger represents something darker than Jack's hunger for leadership. Jack craves validation. Roger seems to crave release. The performance is restrained, but that restraint makes the character feel dangerous. In group scenes, watch where he stands, often slightly behind Jack, not seeking attention, waiting. The film wisely avoids over-explaining him. Mystery amplifies menace. The little ones, the younger boys, also serve a structural purpose beyond vulnerability. They embody fear. Their belief in the beast isn't rational, but it's contagious. The actors playing them lean into genuine anxiety rather than exaggerated hysteria. Wide eyes, clutched hands, huddled formations at night. Their fear fuels Jack's authority because he offers action instead of reassurance. Protecting them becomes a justification for aggression. That's how demagogues operate. Fear first, then force. Ensemble chemistry matters enormously in these dynamics. The boys needed to feel like they had a shared past, like they'd marched together before crashing together. The physical drills and coordinated movement early in the film establish that unity. You see it in how they line up instinctively when someone issues a command. That muscle memory makes the later fragmentation more striking. When they splinter into tribes, the shift isn't abstract, it's physical. Lines become circles. Order becomes chaos. There's a particularly effective use of chanting in later scenes. As Jack's faction embraces ritual, individual voices dissolve into collective rhythm. The actors commit fully to that loss of individuality. Painted faces, synchronized movements, raised spears. It's primal theater. But beneath the surface spectacle, what you're really watching is peer pressure weaponized. No one boy seems fully in control of the frenzy. The group energy takes over. That's the uncomfortable truth the ensemble captures. Savagery is easier in numbers. Responsibility diffuses. Accountability evaporates. The performances sell that psychological shift. Boys who once hesitated begin to participate, not because they're evil, but because belonging feels safer than dissent. The actors don't overplay this transformation. It happens in glances, in who stands where, in who laughs along. And then there's the erosion of loyalty. Ralph doesn't lose followers through dramatic betrayal. He loses them gradually. A few drift away after a hunting success. A few more during moments of frustration. The ensemble handles these shifts subtly. No grand speeches, just repositioning. The camera often captures these changes in blocking, who's in frame with whom. It's visual storytelling layered onto performance. What makes the supporting cast effective isn't that each character gets extensive backstory. They don't. The script doesn't allow for it. Instead, they function as emotional amplifiers. Piggy's humiliation stings more because others witness it. Simon's isolation deepens because no one follows him. Jack's power expands because enough boys validate it. The ensemble creates consequence. There's also something haunting about how ordinary they all feel. No exaggerated villainy, no melodramatic hysteria, just boys adapting to new incentives. When violence erupts, it feels less like a sudden rupture and more like momentum reaching its logical conclusion. That tonal consistency depends heavily on the ensemble's restraint. They never tip into parody. By the final act, when the island feels less like paradise and more like battleground, the supporting cast transforms the film's scale. This isn't one antagonist versus one protagonist. It's a micro-society choosing its values. And the actors make that choice feel plausible, even inevitable. Of course, performance can only resonate within a believable world. The island itself, the shelters, the fire pits, the painted faces, the conch shell gleaming in sunlight, becomes a character in its own right. And the way that world was constructed visually plays a massive role in how this descent registers emotionally. Because if the setting doesn't feel real, neither does the collapse. Paradise is a lie in Lord of the Flies. That's the quiet thesis embedded in its production design. On the surface, the island looks like a travel brochure: turquoise water, thick jungle, sun-soaked beaches. But production designer, working within a relatively modest studio budget, understood something crucial. Beauty makes brutality sting harder. If the environment looked hostile from the start, the descent into savagery would feel inevitable. By crafting a lush, inviting world, the film makes the corruption feel tragic. Shot largely on location in Jamaica, the island isn't a constructed soundstage illusion. It's tactile, humid, alive. You can almost feel the heat pressing against skin. That physical authenticity matters. Sweat beads on foreheads. Shirts cling. Sand sticks. The environment isn't just backdrop, it's pressure. Nature doesn't attack the boys, it exhausts them. And exhaustion breeds irritability. Irritability feeds conflict. Early production design choices emphasize openness, wide beaches, clear horizons, sunlight flooding the frame. The first shelters are modest but hopeful. Branches arranged with care, fire pits neatly contained. There's an optimism in those early constructions. You see boys trying to replicate the order they once knew. Straight lines, organized spaces. Even the conch shell, polished and pale, becomes a design focal point, framed against blue sky like a fragile emblem of democracy. But here's where visual craftsmanship deepens the storytelling. As authority erodes, so does spatial order. Shelters decay. Fire pits grow unruly. Jack's faction relocates deeper into the jungle, into denser shadowed terrain. Production design tracks moral descent through geography. Ralph remains associated with the open beach, the place of signals and rescue. Jack claims the interior, the place of hunting and ritual. Civilization hugs the shoreline. Savagery retreats into foliage. Costume design reinforces that shift. At the beginning, the boys' military cadet uniforms signal discipline and shared identity. Clean lines. Structured silhouettes. As days pass, clothing tears, fades, gets discarded. Shirts come off. Faces get painted. The loss of uniformity isn't accidental. It's visual metaphor. When Jack's tribe adopts body paint, it's more than intimidation. It's liberation from individual accountability. Paint becomes armor. A mask that allows impulses to surface without consequence. Look closely at the face paint patterns. They aren't intricate works of art. They're rough, aggressive streaks. Bold colors slashed across skin. The lack of precision makes them feel spontaneous, almost impulsive. And that's the point. The paint isn't about culture, it's about permission. Production design doesn't romanticize the tribal aesthetic. It makes it raw. Props carry symbolic weight too. It makes it raw. Props carry symbolic weight too. The conch shell, perhaps the most loaded object in the story, is treated with near-religious framing early on. Often centered, held carefully, passed deliberately. Its smooth surface contrasts with the jagged environment. When it eventually loses power, the absence feels louder than its presence ever did. That's design doing narrative work. Fire, both prop and environmental element, evolves visually throughout the film. In early scenes, it's controlled, small, hopeful, meant for signaling rescue. Later, flames grow chaotic, consuming more space in the frame. The color palette shifts subtly alongside this progression. Early sequences lean into warm golds and bright blues. Later scenes favor harsher contrasts: deep greens, heavy shadows, orange flames cutting through darkness. The island doesn't change, the perception of it does. One particularly effective design decision is the contrast between the boys' makeshift structures. Ralph's camp remains rudimentary but organized, simple lean-tos, fire carefully tended. Jack's camp becomes theatrical, skulls mounted, spears displayed, space arranged for intimidation rather than comfort. The physical environment mirrors ideological divergence. One side builds to survive, the other builds to dominate. And then there's the use of natural sound integrated into design, though we'll explore audio more deeply later. Visually, the jungle is dense, layered, almost claustrophobic in certain compositions. Branches frame characters like bars. Vines hang like obstacles. As Jack's tribe moves deeper inward, the island feels less like sanctuary and more like maze. Production design doesn't alter the geography. It alters how it's filmed and inhabited. What makes the craftsmanship effective is an extravagance. The budget didn't allow sprawling constructed sets or elaborate effects. Instead, authenticity does the heavy lifting. Real sand, real foliage, real ocean. That grounded physicality makes the collapse believable. When violence erupts, it stains something tangible. By the final act, the beach no longer feels like paradise. It feels exposed, vulnerable. The same sunlight that once symbolized hope now illuminates chaos. That's visual storytelling at its most elemental, light and space reshaped by behavior. Yet design alone doesn't create immersion. The way the camera observes this world, the angles it chooses, the movement it favors, the light it captures, determines whether we feel like distant spectators or trapped participants. Because once the island is built, it needs to be seen, and how it's seen changes everything. The most striking visual moments in Lord of the Flies don't announce themselves with flashy technique. They creep up on you. A low-angle shot of boys chanting under flickering firelight. A wide frame where Ralph stands small against endless ocean. Cinematography here isn't ornamental, it's psychological. The camera doesn't just record the island, it chooses sides, shifts allegiance, and quietly tracks the erosion of order. Cinematographer Martin Furrh approaches the film with a naturalistic eye. Shot on 35mm film, the texture carries that early 90s grain. Subtle, organic, slightly rough around the edges. That grain matters. It keeps the image from feeling glossy. Paradise never looks airbrushed. Skin has texture. Shadows feel thick. You're not watching a fantasy island. You're watching heat shimmer and sweat gather under real sun. Early in the film, compositions emphasize balance. Frames are wide and stable. The horizon line often sits calmly across the image, visually reinforcing the idea of possibility. Ralph frequently occupies the center of these early shots, framed symmetrically when addressing the group. Order is literally centered. The camera holds steady during assemblies, mimicking the stability Ralph is trying to enforce. Then, instability begins creeping in. As Jack's influence grows, the cinematography subtly shifts toward more handheld movement, especially during hunting sequences and confrontations. The camera starts to breathe with the characters. Slight shakes, looser framing, tighter close-ups. It's not chaotic filmmaking, but it's less controlled. That visual looseness mirrors the social unraveling. Control behind the camera diminishes as control within the narrative does. Lighting plays an equally crucial role. Daytime scenes on the beach are flooded with bright, almost unforgiving sunlight. There's nowhere to hide in those early moments. Transparency dominates. But as the boys splinter into factions, more scenes unfold under canopy or at night. Firelight replaces sunlight. And firelight is unpredictable. Faces half-lit, eyes flickering, shadows dancing across painted skin. The chiaroscuro effect. The dramatic interplay between light and shadow transforms teenagers into mythic figures. Ordinary boys start looking primal. One of the most effective visual motifs involves perspective. Ralph is often shot from eye level or slightly above, keeping him grounded, human. Jack, particularly in later scenes, gets lower angle framing. The camera tilts up at him as he issues commands or stands elevated on rocks. It's subtle but powerful. Power is amplified by angle. Authority becomes visual hierarchy. During hunting sequences, Furrh leans into kinetic framing. The camera moves with the boys, tracking through foliage, ducking branches, capturing frantic energy. Cuts become quicker. Composition tightens. The jungle feels dense and suffocating. Compare that to the beach scenes, where negative space dominates and breathing room exists. Geography becomes emotional state. There's a particularly effective use of long lenses during moments of isolation. When Ralph begins losing allies, shots compress distance, making the group appear closer together yet emotionally farther apart. The ocean, once expansive and hopeful, starts to feel like a barrier rather than escape. That shift isn't achieved through dialogue. It's achieved through framing. And then there's the climactic chaos. Without diving too heavily into spoiler territory, the final act uses fire and smoke as visual distortion. Flames flicker in foreground while action unfolds behind them, partially obscured. The camera often shoots through obstacles, branches, embers, heat haze, creating a sense of fragmentation. Vision itself feels compromised. You're not granted clean perspective. Confusion becomes immersive. What Furrh avoids is romanticizing violence. The camera doesn't glamorize brutality with slow-motion spectacle or stylized excess. It stays close, sometimes uncomfortably so. That proximity forces you to confront action rather than admire it. When the boys chant in ritual, the framing tightens around faces rather than pulling back for aesthetic grandeur. Savagery isn't cinematic, it's claustrophobic. Aspect ratio also matters. The film uses a standard widescreen frame, allowing for environmental context while keeping character relationships visible. In group scenes, you can see shifting loyalties within the same shot. Who steps forward, who hesitates, who looks away. The width becomes social commentary. It's not just landscape, it's relational geometry. Here's what's particularly effective. The island never changes, but the way it's photographed does. Early blue skies feel open. Later blue skies feel indifferent. Early jungle feels adventurous. Later jungle feels predatory. The cinematography guides perception without altering reality. That's sophisticated visual storytelling. If there's a critique, it's that the film occasionally leans into conventional framing during dialogue-heavy scenes, prioritizing coverage over bold visual experimentation. Shot-reverse shot patterns dominate certain confrontations. But even within those conventions, subtle camera placement reinforces power shifts. By the end, when authority is shattered and fear reigns, the camera feels less like an observer and more like a participant, caught in smoke, moving with panic, searching for clarity in a world that's lost it. That evolution from stability to fragmentation is deliberate. It mirrors the narrative arc almost beat for beat. But what the eyes absorb, the ears intensify. Because once chanting replaces conversation and silence becomes heavy with dread, sound and score begin shaping emotion before logic can catch up. And in a story about fear imagined and real, audio becomes its own kind of beast. Before a single spear is thrown, before a single rule collapses, Lord of the Flies tells you how to feel through sound. Not loudly, not with sweeping orchestral declarations, but with something subtler, atmosphere. The audio landscape in this film works almost invisibly at first, which is exactly why its escalation hits harder later. You don't notice it building, you just feel tension tightening. The score, composed by Philippe Sardé, avoids heroic themes or sentimental cues. Instead, it leans into minimalism and unease. Early musical passages are restrained. Soft strings, sparse motifs, almost hesitant in their phrasing. There's space between notes. That space matters. Silence becomes texture. The island isn't immediately framed as threatening. It's framed as uncertain. The music doesn't tell you, danger is coming. It whispers that something isn't quite stable. Listen to the early beach assemblies. Wind hums. Waves crash rhythmically. Dialogue sits cleanly in the mix. Natural sound dominates. That grounded audio design reinforces the illusion of control. The world feels open, airy, rational. Even the boys' arguments carry the acoustic clarity of daylight. Civilization, in sonic terms, is structured and legible. Then chanting enters the soundscape, and everything changes. As Jack's faction leans into ritual, percussion grows more prominent. Drums pulse beneath scenes, sometimes almost subliminally. The rhythm isn't elaborate, it's primal, repetitive, hypnotic. It mirrors heartbeat acceleration. The effect is psychological. You're not being told to feel fear. Your body starts sinking to tension. One of the most effective techniques the film employs is the layering of diegetic and non-diegetic sound. Diegetic sound. Audio that exists within the world of the story blends seamlessly with score. When boys chant around a fire, their voices become percussion. When spears strike ground, the impact echoes into the musical rhythm. The line between soundtrack and environment blurs. Civilization dissolves sonically before it fully dissolves visually. Silence plays an equally powerful role. There are moments, particularly involving Simon, where the score pulls back almost entirely. Ambient jungle noise replaces music. Leaves rustle. Insects buzz. Breath becomes audible. That restraint amplifies isolation. Without musical guidance, you're left alone with uncertainty. Silence here isn't absence, it's pressure. And then there's the use of fire. Crackling flames become an audio motif. Early on, fire sounds controlled, gentle, contained. Later, during chaotic sequences, flames roar aggressively, almost drowning dialogue. The mix intentionally overwhelms clarity. Order gives way to noise. Communication collapses under volume. You can hear society burning. Sardé's orchestration never swells into triumphant catharsis. Even at narrative peaks, the music resists emotional manipulation. Instead of telling you how to feel about events, it underscores instability. Dissonant strings creep under confrontations. Low tones rumble beneath arguments. It's subtle, but effective. The score doesn't judge the boys. It observes their unraveling. There's a particularly striking use of sound during moments of collective frenzy. Chanting builds in layers. One voice, then several, then many. The repetition becomes mantra. Words lose meaning. Rhythm takes over. It's almost ritualistic hypnosis. That's not accidental. The sound design mirrors the psychological shift from individual thought to group identity. Once chanting dominates, individuality fades. Dialogue disappears into collective noise. Contrast that with Ralph's quieter moments. When he's isolated, the soundscape thins. Wind across beach. Distant surf. Occasional bird calls. The emptiness feels heavy. He's surrounded by beauty but sonically alone. That loneliness is communicated more through audio than dialogue. What the film avoids, wisely, is melodramatic scoring during tragedy. When devastating events unfold, the music doesn't spike into theatrical grief. It holds back. That restraint makes the impact sharper. You're not cushioned by swelling strings. You're left with raw aftermath. Technically, the mix balances natural sound and score without overwhelming either. Dialogue remains intelligible even during tense sequences, but environmental noise presses in. The jungle never fully goes quiet. Even in stillness, there's life humming. That constant ambient presence reinforces the idea that nature is indifferent. It watches. It doesn't intervene. If there's a critique, it's that the score occasionally fades into the background during mid-film stretches, leaning heavily on environmental audio, rather than distinct thematic motifs. Unlike some survival dramas with instantly recognizable musical signatures, Lord of the Flies opts for atmospheric cohesion over memorable melody. But perhaps that's appropriate. This story isn't about heroism. It's about disintegration. By the final act, sound becomes chaos, layered over chaos. Chanting, fire, shouting, wind. It's sensory overload. And then, suddenly, clarity returns. The contrast between noise and sudden quiet lands like a shockwave. Order, briefly restored, sounds foreign. Yet none of this audio precision would matter without the conditions that shaped it. The heat of location shooting, the logistical challenges of working with a large group of young actors, the unpredictable environment of a real island. Behind the camera, the production journey was its own test of order versus chaos. Because sometimes, the making of a film mirrors the story it's telling. Filming Lord of the Flies on a real island wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was a logistical gamble. Shooting in Jamaica meant heat, humidity, unpredictable weather, and the challenge of coordinating a large cast of young actors in an environment that doesn't care about call sheets. On paper, the story is about boys losing control. Behind the scenes, maintaining control required military-level organization. Working with minors on location always complicates scheduling. Labor laws limit hours. Schooling requirements must be met. Energy levels fluctuate. Now add tropical heat to that equation. Long days under direct sun meant hydration breaks, medical supervision, and constant attention to safety. The irony isn't subtle. A film about collapsing authority required rigorous off-camera discipline to function at all. Harry Hook's directing style reportedly leaned collaborative rather than authoritarian. That approach matters when working with teenagers. Instead of forcing rigid line readings, Hook allowed room for natural reactions, especially during group scenes. The chanting sequences, for example, benefited from that looseness. Rather than over-choreographing every movement, he encouraged organic escalation. The result feels less staged and more volatile. Controlled chaos. Carefully managed, but alive. Of course, controlled chaos is still chaos. Coordinating scenes with a dozen boys running through dense jungle isn't simple blocking. It's choreography in uneven terrain. Camera operators had to move with them, often handheld, navigating roots, rocks, and brush. That physical environment shaped the cinematography as much as artistic intent did. Sometimes the instability you see on screen comes from genuine terrain challenges, and that authenticity bleeds into the final product. Weather posed its own narrative complications. Tropical light shifts quickly. Cloud cover changes exposure within minutes. Continuity becomes fragile. Maintaining visual consistency across scenes filmed hours or days apart requires meticulous planning. Fire sequences, especially, demand safety protocols that limit takes. Flames look spontaneous. They are anything but. Every ignition is calculated. Every extinguish planned. There's also the psychological dimension of filming intense material with young actors. The story demands bullying, violence, emotional breakdown. Creating that atmosphere without causing real distress is delicate work. Directors in such situations often separate rehearsal tone from performance tone, ensuring that once cut is called, the environment resets. Cast bonding off-camera becomes essential. A divided ensemble in real life would undermine on-screen trust. Interestingly, several cast members have reflected in interviews over the years that the shoot felt like a summer camp with darker scenes layered in. That duality likely helped maintain morale. When cameras weren't rolling, they were still teenagers on an island. Swimming. Joking. Building camaraderie. That off-screen unity contrasts sharply with the tribal fracture portrayed on screen, and perhaps that contrast allowed them to push further emotionally during takes. Budget constraints also influenced production choices. This wasn't a massive blockbuster with unlimited resources. Practical effects dominated. Real fire. Real locations. Minimal reliance on elaborate visual effects. That limitation actually strengthens the film's grounded tone. Nothing feels digitally manufactured because it wasn't. Smoke is smoke. Sweat is sweat. One of the more challenging sequences involved large-scale group action at night firelight, chanting, movement. Night shoots are already exhausting. Add minors and open flame, and complexity multiplies. Lighting rigs had to simulate depth without overpowering the natural flicker of fire. Sound recording required isolating dialogue amid environmental noise. Every technical department worked overtime to make chaos readable. There's also the emotional toll of filming the story's most tragic moments. Without spoiling specifics, scenes involving irreversible consequences demand careful staging. Multiple takes can drain young actors. Directors must balance authenticity with protection. The fact that those sequences land with emotional weight speaks to both performance commitment and production sensitivity. If anything, the behind-the-scenes journey mirrors the film's themes in reverse. On screen, order decays into disorder. Off-screen, potential disorder had to be shaped into coherent storytelling. discipline created the illusion of collapse. That paradox defines filmmaking in general, manufactured spontaneity. Once production wrapped, the film entered post-production with a clear tonal identity, grounded, naturalistic, tense. Editing choices preserved much of that rawness rather than polishing it into glossy adventure fare. The finished product felt immediate rather than stylized. But no matter how carefully crafted, a film's ultimate test happens outside the island, at the box office. Audiences decide whether an adaptation resonates or sinks. And for a story as bleak as Lord of the Flies, commercial reception was never guaranteed. Because allegory doesn't always sell tickets. From the beginning, Lord of the Flies was never positioned as a four-quadrant crowd pleaser. This is not a feel-good survival adventure. It's a moral autopsy. And in 1990, that made its commercial prospects complicated. Produced and distributed by Columbia Pictures, the film was released in March 1990 in the United States. The timing is telling. Early spring is often a quieter box office corridor, less competitive than summer, less prestige-focused than award season. It's where studios sometimes place mid-budget dramas that don't neatly fit blockbuster formulas. That positioning suggests tempered expectations. No one anticipated this becoming a cultural juggernaut. Financially, the film carried a modest production budget, reported to be around $6 million. For a location-heavy drama with a large young cast, that's lean but manageable. No expensive visual effects. No A-list salaries. The island itself provided production value. From a studio perspective, the risk wasn't astronomical, but neither was the upside. At the box office, the film earned approximately $13 million domestically. On paper, that looks like a modest success, more than doubling its production budget. But context matters. Marketing costs aren't reflected in that production figure, and theatrical splits mean studios don't keep every ticket dollar. By Hollywood standards, this wasn't a breakout hit. It performed respectably, then faded. And here's the critical point. Its commercial performance reflects its tone. Audiences in 1990 were gravitating toward high-concept entertainment, action spectacles, broad comedies, escapist fare. Lord of the Flies offers none of that comfort. It's intense, unsettling, stark in its message. Word of mouth for films like this often skews polarized. Some viewers admire the seriousness. Others find it oppressive. Opening weekend numbers were modest rather than explosive. The film didn't crash and burn, but it didn't ignite either. Its box office legs, how well it held week to week, were steady but unspectacular. There was no dramatic drop-off, which suggests a core audience engaged with it. But there wasn't a wave of new viewers flooding theaters either. Internationally, the film saw limited theatrical impact compared to major studio tentpoles of the era. The story's familiarity, being a required reading staple in many schools, likely boosted awareness, but didn't guarantee ticket sales. In fact, that familiarity may have worked against it. When a novel is deeply embedded in academic culture, audiences sometimes assume they already know the story. Urgency to see the adaptation diminishes. However, where the film arguably found longer life was in home media and educational settings. VHS rentals and classroom viewings extended its reach beyond theatrical windows. For many viewers who encountered the story as students, this version became their primary visual reference. Commercial impact isn't always measured in opening weekends. Sometimes it's measured in endurance. Comparatively, Peter Brook's 1963 adaptation had been critically revered but commercially limited. Hook's version performed better financially, though it never achieved mainstream blockbuster status. In the landscape of literary adaptations, it occupies middle ground. Not a flop, not a phenomenon. Sustainable, if subdued. There's also the question of audience expectation. The marketing leaned into survival drama elements. Boys stranded, nature against humanity. But the film's real engine is psychological disintegration. Viewers expecting adventure may have found something harsher. That tonal mismatch can influence box office reception more than quality does. From a profitability standpoint, The modest budget likely ensured the film avoided financial disaster. It didn't need superhero numbers to justify itself. It needed stability. And it achieved that. In studio terms, it was a calculated adaptation that neither transformed the market nor embarrassed the ledger. Yet numbers alone don't define legacy. Plenty of films open quietly and grow culturally. Others earn millions and vanish from memory. The real question becomes, how was this version received critically? Did reviewers see it as a necessary reinterpretation or an unnecessary remake? And more importantly, did audiences view it as a faithful extension of Golding's vision or a diluted modernization? Because critical reception shapes how a film is remembered long after ticket sales are counted. Critics didn't approach the 1990 Lord of the Flies with neutrality. They approached it with comparison. Any remake of a respected literary adaptation walks into that storm automatically. Peter Brook's 1963 version had earned a reputation for stark authenticity and raw realism. Golding's novel itself carried near sacred status in academic circles. So Harry Hook's reinterpretation wasn't judged on its own terms at first. It was measured against legacy. On aggregate review platforms, the film holds a mixed to negative critical reception. Rotten Tomatoes reflects a divided consensus, with critics often describing it as competent but unnecessary. That word, unnecessary, appears frequently in discussions of remakes. The prevailing question wasn't whether the film worked, but whether it needed to exist at all. Many reviewers acknowledged the technical polish, the tropical cinematography, the grounded performances from young actors, the streamlined pacing, but they also pointed out what they perceived as thematic dilution. Golding's novel operates like a philosophical scalpel, precise, unsettling, uncompromising. Some critics felt the 1990 version softened that blade. By clarifying hero and villain roles, by sharpening Ralph and Jack into more conventional opposites, the film arguably reduced the ambiguity that made the novel so haunting. Yet not all reception leaned dismissive. Several critics appreciated the modernization, particularly the shift to American military cadets. That choice reframed the allegory in a way that felt immediate for contemporary audiences. Instead of a distant British parable, the story became an American reflection. For some reviewers, that cultural transposition added urgency rather than subtracting nuance. Audience response told a slightly different story. On IMDb and similar platforms, viewer ratings tend to hover in moderate territory, not overwhelmingly positive, not deeply negative. The pattern suggests something interesting. While critics debated necessity and fidelity, audiences engaged more directly with the narrative impact. Many viewers who encountered the film in educational settings or during adolescence describe it as disturbing and memorable. Emotional imprint sometimes outweighs critical quibble. The critical divide often centers on tone. Brook's 1963 version was shot in black and white with non-professional actors, creating documentary realism. Hook's film is more polished, more narratively conventional. Some critics equated polish with compromise. But polish doesn't automatically equal dilution. It can also mean accessibility. And accessibility, especially for younger viewers, matters. There's also the broader cultural context of 1990. The Cold War was ending. The world felt like it was shifting into a new era of uncertainty. Stories about internal collapse and tribalism resonated differently than they had in 1963. The film's reception may have been colored by that transitional moment. Allegory hits differently depending on the decade absorbing it. Awards recognition, however, was minimal. The film did not become an awards season contender, nor did it dominate critics' year-end lists. It occupied quieter space, respectable craftsmanship, divisive reinterpretation, not revolutionary, not disastrous. Over time, reevaluation has softened some of the harsher early critiques. While few argue that the 1990 version surpasses Brook's adaptation or Golding's novel, many now see it as a legitimate companion piece rather than a redundant remake. Its emphasis on American identity, military conditioning, and adolescent masculinity gives it a distinct thematic fingerprint. Perhaps the most telling aspect of its cultural response is endurance in classrooms. For generations of students assigned the novel, this version became a visual supplement. That educational longevity ensures relevance beyond box office metrics or critic scores. Cultural footprint isn't always loud. Sometimes it's steady. The discourse around the film often reveals more about audience expectation than about execution. If you approach it demanding strict literary fidelity, you may find it lacking. If you approach it as a character-driven survival drama with allegorical undertones, it lands differently. Which brings us to the final, and perhaps most important, layer. What does this film ultimately say? Beyond adaptation debates and box office returns, beyond performance and production, what themes endure? Does the 1990 version sharpen Golding's central message, or does it reshape it into something new? Because legacy isn't built on numbers or reviews, it's built on meaning. Let's talk about the beast. Not the imagined creature in the jungle, not the shadow in the trees, the real one. The one the boys slowly realize isn't something they can hunt or stab or burn away. The 1990 Lord of the Flies ultimately lives or dies on how convincingly it delivers that idea. The beast is us. At its core, this story has always been about the fragility of civilization. Strip away institutions, consequences, adult supervision, and what remains. Harry Hook's version reframes that question through an American lens. These aren't naive choir boys, they're military cadets. Trained, disciplined, conditioned to follow structure. And yet structure collapses anyway. That choice subtly shifts Golding's thesis. It's not innocence corrupted, it's order exposed as thin. Think about the conch shell. Early on, it gleams in sunlight, an almost sacred object passed between speakers. It represents democracy voice, fairness, restraint. But democracy only works when participants agree to honor it. Once Jack stops respecting the conch, its power evaporates. No explosion. No dramatic shattering at first. Just indifference. That's the film's quiet warning. Systems don't fail because they're attacked from outside. They fail when people decide they no longer matter. Masculinity is another undercurrent the 1990 version sharpens. These boys are raised in a culture of command and competition. Strength earns respect. Hesitation reads as weakness. Ralph tries to lead through reason. Jack leads through spectacle paint, ritual, action. Guess which one feels more immediate to frightened teenagers? The film suggests that charisma often beats conscience. Not because it's right, because it's louder. Simon's role anchors the spiritual dimension. He understands the truth before anyone else. The beast isn't external, it's internal. But insight without power changes nothing. His tragedy isn't just personal, it's philosophical. Truth alone cannot stop mob mentality. The film stages this realization without grand speeches, just a boy recognizing something the group refuses to see. Fear drives everything. Fear of the unknown. Fear of losing control. Fear of being alone. Jack weaponizes that fear masterfully. He offers certainty where Ralph offers patience, action where Ralph offers planning. In times of anxiety, decisive force feels safer than debate. That dynamic feels uncomfortably timeless. The island becomes a microcosm for political and social fracture. And then there's the ending. Without spoiling specifics for those who somehow remain uninitiated, the final rescue lands with heavy irony. Order returns abruptly. Authority reappears. But nothing is restored. The boys are saved physically, yet something irreversible has happened. The film doesn't overplay this moment. It lets the weight sit. Relief mixes with shame. Civilization arrives too late to undo what civilization failed to prevent. So where does this adaptation stand in legacy terms? It doesn't eclipse Golding's novel. Few adaptations could. It doesn't surpass Peter Brook's austere 1963 film in raw minimalism. But it doesn't need to. Its legacy lies in reinterpretation. By Americanizing the characters and emphasizing institutional conditioning, it asks a slightly different question. If even trained cadets collapse into tribalism, how secure are our own structures? Is it flawless? No. At times, the moral lines feel clearer than Golding intended. Jack veers closer to archetype than ambiguity. Certain philosophical subtleties become dramatized confrontation. But there's value in clarity, especially for younger audiences encountering this story for the first time. Rewatchability depends on what you're seeking. As pure entertainment, it's uncomfortable. As allegory, it's enduring. The performances ground it. The island immerses you. The sound design unsettles. And the message lingers. Who is this film for? Viewers interested in psychological survival drama. Students exploring literary adaptation. Anyone curious how the same story morphs across decades and cultural contexts. It's not escapism. It's confrontation. It's confrontation. Here's my verdict. The 1990 Lord of the Flies is a solid, thoughtful adaptation that trades some philosophical ambiguity for emotional immediacy. It doesn't reinvent the allegory, but it recontextualizes it. And sometimes that's enough. Because each generation needs its own mirror. This one simply held the glass up to a different audience. In the end, the island was never the point. Here's my verdict. The 1990 Lord of the Flies is a solid, thoughtful adaptation that trades some philosophical ambiguity for emotional immediacy. It doesn't reinvent the allegory, but it recontextualizes it. And sometimes that's enough. Because each generation needs its own mirror. This one simply held the glass up to a different audience. In the end, the island was never the point. The jungle was never the enemy. The fire wasn't just destruction. The beast was always waiting. And it didn't need to be summoned. If the 1990 Lord of the Flies ends with rescue, it doesn't end with reassurance. That final image lingers not because of spectacle, but because of what it implies. Authority can return, uniforms can reappear, adults can step back into frame, but the capacity for violence never left. It was simply revealed. And that's where this version grows more interesting the longer you sit with it. Let's push deeper into Ralph. We tend to read him as the good leader, rational, fair, focused on rescue. But look closer. Ralph's authority depends heavily on the symbols of order, the conch, the fire, the idea of rules. When those symbols lose their power, he struggles to adapt. He doesn't inspire loyalty through charisma. He relies on structure doing the work for him. Once structure erodes, so does his influence. That's not a flaw in performance. It's a philosophical choice. Ralph represents institutional leadership, the belief that systems protect us. Jack represents populist leadership, emotion, spectacle, fear-driven unity. When the boys abandon Ralph, they aren't necessarily choosing evil. They're choosing immediacy. Protection now. Meat now. Power now. Democracy is slow. Tribalism is efficient. And here's the uncomfortable question. Is Ralph a strong leader, or simply the least dangerous option available? His vision is morally correct, but it's not emotionally compelling. In moments of crisis, that matters. Jack understands something Ralph doesn't. Fear needs direction. If you don't provide it, someone else will. Now consider the military cadet framing again. These boys were trained in hierarchy before the crash. So why does hierarchy fail? Because hierarchy without accountability mutates. On the island, there's no higher authority to answer to, no court-martial, no consequences. The chain of command becomes self-defined. Jack doesn't overthrow democracy through argument. He renders it irrelevant. He offers something louder. He offers something louder. This is where the film resonates differently today than it did in 1990. Watch it now. In an era of polarized politics, viral outrage, online mob mentality, and the chanting scenes feel less like allegory and more like documentation. The way individuals dissolve into collective rhythm, the way dissenting voices get shouted down, the way spectacle overrides nuance. It's disturbingly contemporary. The painted faces, masks, digital avatars, anonymity that frees people from accountability. Once identity blurs, behavior shifts. The film didn't predict social media, but it understood tribal psychology long before algorithms amplified it. Now let's talk about Roger again. Roger isn't loud. He isn't charismatic. He doesn't seek leadership. He simply acts when restraint disappears. In political theory terms, he represents what philosopher Thomas Hobbes feared: the state of nature where life becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Jack thrives in chaos. Roger embodies it. Golding famously rejected the optimistic view of human nature proposed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the idea that humans are inherently good but corrupted by society. Lord of the Flies argues the opposite. Society restrains darkness. Remove it, and something primal emerges. But the 1990 film complicates that slightly. These boys come pre-packaged with societal conditioning, competition, aggression, hierarchy. Maybe society doesn't just restrain violence. Maybe it plants it in structured form. The island doesn't create brutality. It removes supervision. That nuance gives this adaptation a sharper edge than it's often credited for. Now imagine one more layer. What if the group dynamic were different? If the stranded children weren't trained cadets, but students from a cooperative environment, would the outcome change? The film doesn't answer that. But it raises the question indirectly by choosing military uniforms as its starting point. It's not accidental. It's commentary. Let's return to Simon for a moment. Simon's understanding of the beast is spiritual, internal. But insight without influence is powerless. He speaks truth, yet lacks social capital. In modern terms, he's the whistleblower no one listens to. The voice drowned by louder narratives. The tragedy isn't just his fate. It's that clarity existed and was ignored. And that might be the film's most devastating takeaway. Civilization doesn't collapse because truth vanishes. It collapses because truth loses to momentum. Even the final rescue scene, when adults re-enter frame, carries a sting. The officer who arrives represents structured authority. But what does he really restore? Order on the island. Yes. But beyond the island, the world he comes from is engaged in conflict too. The film doesn't hammer this point the way the novel does, but it's there. Adults wage organized wars. The boys simply rehearsed. That parallel reframes the ending. The island wasn't an anomaly. It was a miniature. So what is the extended legacy of the 1990 version? It becomes a generational bridge. For viewers who found Brooks' 1963 film too austere or inaccessible, this adaptation provides emotional clarity. It doesn't replace the original novel. It refracts it. And in doing so, it ensures Golding's thesis remains alive in cultural circulation. Is it perfect? No. Does it simplify certain ambiguities? Yes. But does it provoke? Absolutely. And maybe that's the measure that matters most. Because decades later, we're still asking the same question the boys failed to answer: when fear rises, who do we become? And more importantly, let's go even deeper. Strip away the allegory for a second. Forget Hobbes. Forget Rousseau. Forget literary analysis. Look at the raw mechanics of what happens on that island. A group of boys experiences trauma, a plane crash. They survive. There are no adults. They are afraid. And no one ever properly processes that fear. That's the psychological engine of the entire film. There's no grief ritual, no structured decompression, no shared acknowledgement of mortality. Instead, they pivot immediately into logistics, fire, shelter, leadership. Function replaces feeling. Ralph channels fear into order. Jack channels fear into action. Simon internalizes it. Piggy intellectualizes it. But fear, unprocessed, doesn't disappear. It mutates. This is where the 1990 version quietly excels. Because the military framing makes emotional suppression believable, these boys are trained to maintain composure, to follow orders, to stay strong. Vulnerability isn't part of the curriculum. So when panic creeps in, when the little ones whisper about the beast, there's no emotional vocabulary to handle it. Fear becomes myth, and myth becomes weapon. Jack doesn't invent the beast. He exploits it. He understands something primal. If you control the narrative of danger, you control the group. Leaders throughout history have done exactly that. Identify an external threat. Offer protection. Consolidate loyalty. The island doesn't create politics. It accelerates it. Now look at the turning point, when ritual replaces rule. The chanting scenes aren't just about savagery. They're about belonging. When the boys paint their faces, they aren't only hiding from shame. They're gaining identity. A tribe. A shared rhythm. A collective heartbeat. A collective heartbeat. Humans crave belonging more than they crave fairness. That's the film's cruel insight. Ralph offers rescue, a distant future reward. Jack offers power, immediate validation. When survival feels uncertain, immediacy wins. And here's the most uncomfortable thought. The boys who join Jack aren't monsters. They're normal. That's what makes the story sting decades later. There isn't a clear line where good boys become evil. Boys. There's just gradual compromise. A laugh at something wrong. A look away. A step toward the louder voice. Moral erosion rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. It feels incremental. The 1990 film captures that incrementality in body language more than dialogue. Watch how boys who once stood beside Ralph slowly drift closer to Jack in group compositions. No declarations. Just repositioning. Alignment by proximity. It's subtle. It's accurate. And then we arrive at something even more unsettling, relief. When authority returns at the end, the boys break down. They cry. They remember their children. The return of adults restores hierarchy instantly, which raises a haunting implication. Were they savage because they were free, or because they were unsupervised? Freedom without accountability becomes chaos. But supervision without moral growth creates dependency. The film doesn't solve this paradox. It just exposes it. Now consider how differently this plays in today's world. Modern audiences live in an era of decentralized authority. Information spreads without gatekeepers. Tribal lines form digitally. Outrage organizes faster than deliberation. The island metaphor feels less like fiction and more like framework. The conch is the rule of civil discourse. It works only when everyone agrees to honor it. Once someone decides rules are optional, the system falters. That's not dated allegory. That's ongoing reality. And maybe that's why the 1990 adaptation deserves more credit than it initially received. It may not carry the stark austerity of the 1963 film, but its American framing makes its warning culturally intimate. These aren't abstract British schoolboys. They're reflections of Western institutional identity. Now let's flip the lens. What if the island is not a place where civilization collapses, but a place where truth surfaces? In structured society, aggression is regulated. Hierarchy is institutionalized. Competition is rewarded in controlled forms. On the island, those same impulses lose containment. What we call savagery might simply be unregulated social instinct. That interpretation doesn't excuse behavior. It complicates it. The beast isn't born on the island. It's revealed. And that's why the story continues to unsettle. Because the island is temporary. But the tendencies it exposes are not. So maybe the real horror of Lord of the Flies isn't that boys can become violent. It's that under the right pressure, most groups can. The uniforms change. The island changes. The island changes. The century changes. But the question remains stubbornly the same. If the conch shattered tomorrow, would we still listen? Let's take this one layer further, past politics, past psychology, into something more unsettling. What if the island isn't about the collapse of civilization at all? What if it's about how thin identity really is? In the opening act, every boy arrives carrying labels: cadet, leader, intellectual, outsider, subordinate. Those labels feel stable. They're reinforced by uniform, by training, by structure. Identity seems fixed, but the island strips context away. No teachers, no parents, no rank above them, no external validation. And without external validation, identity starts to wobble. Ralph believes he's a leader because others recognize him as one. When that recognition fades, his confidence erodes. Jack believes he deserves authority. When he doesn't receive it through formal vote, he creates a new system where he cannot lose. Piggy believes intelligence should earn respect. It doesn't. That dissonance fractures him internally before anything else does. Identity, the film argues, is negotiated, not inherent. Remove the audience. Change the rules. Shift the incentives. People shift. That's what makes the transformation believable. No supernatural force, no possession, no curse, just altered conditions. And then there's something even darker. Joy. Look closely at the hunting scenes. At first, there's hesitation, then excitement, then exhilaration. The boys don't just survive. They experience adrenaline, power, unity, ritual. Violence isn't merely strategic, it becomes bonding. That's the line the film tiptoes toward without fully stating. Shared aggression creates cohesion faster than shared ideals. Ralph's camp bonds around hope, abstract, future-oriented. Jack's camp bonds around action, immediate, visceral. Guess which spreads faster? History answers that question often. And yet, the film never suggests that goodness is impossible. It suggests it is fragile. That's different. Fragility implies possibility, but it requires maintenance. Attention. Collective agreement. The conch shell is fragile. Fire is fragile. Rescue hope is fragile. Rescue hope is fragile. Even conscience is fragile. Even conscience is fragile. The beast is not stronger because it is bigger. It is stronger because it requires less effort. That may be the film's most ruthless observation. It takes work to build shelter. It takes seconds to burn it down. It takes restraint to honor a rule. It takes impulse to break it. Now consider something else. Shame. When the officer arrives at the end, the boys collapse into tears. Why? Because the presence of adult authority reactivates their previous identity. Cadets again. Children again. The spell breaks. But the tears aren't just relief. They're recognition. They understand what they've become, and that awareness suggests something hopeful. Conscience survived, even if buried. The beast did not fully consume them. It merely took advantage of the vacuum, which leads to one final, unsettling question. If adults had never arrived, would the boys have stabilized into a new society? Or would escalation continue indefinitely? The film doesn't show that future, but it implies it. Power structures would calcify. Hierarchy would formalize. Ritual would become law. Civilization would return, just shaped differently. That possibility reframes the entire narrative. Maybe the island wasn't a descent into chaos. Maybe it was a violent, accelerated evolution into a harsher order. And if that's true, the story becomes less about losing civilization and more about what kind of civilization emerges when fear sets the blueprint. That idea lingers longer than the final frame. Because the island isn't remote. Because the island isn't remote, it's a pressure chamber, and pressure doesn't create character. It reveals it. So here we are, decades later, still dissecting a story about stranded boys. Not because it's shocking, not because it's violent, but because it asks something disturbingly simple. If the rules disappeared tomorrow, would we protect them? Or would we paint our faces and feel powerful instead? Let's go even further, past fear, past power, into something quieter but just as dangerous, comfort. Because once Jack establishes dominance, something stabilizes. Not morally, not peacefully, but structurally. His tribe has rules, roles, rituals, food distribution, protection patrols. There's rhythm again. It's brutal rhythm, but it's rhythm. That's the paradox Lord of the Flies leaves hanging in the air. Tyranny is still a form of order. And order, even violent order, can feel safer than uncertainty. Ralph's leadership is aspirational. Rescue will come. Fire must be maintained. Patience is required. That's hope-driven governance. It demands delayed gratification. Jack's leadership is immediate. Hunt now. Feast now. Defend now. Defend now. That's survival-driven governance. It satisfies instinct. Under pressure, instinct usually wins. The film never states this outright, but it shows it in how quickly Jack's camp gains momentum once meat becomes central. Food isn't just sustenance, it's power currency. Whoever controls resources controls loyalty. That's not island logic. That's civilization logic distilled. Now zoom out again. That's civilization logic distilled. Now zoom out again. The boys don't just abandon rules, they redefine them. That's the part people miss. Jack doesn't argue that rules are unnecessary. He creates new ones, centered on dominance instead of democracy. The tribe chants together. They enforce unity. They punish dissent. They maintain territory. That's structure, just darker structure. Which means the story isn't a simple morality tale about chaos versus order. It's about competing systems of order. Ralph's system is fragile but ethical. Jack's system is stable but predatory. And the terrifying truth? Predatory systems often scale faster. Now, let's talk about memory. When the officer arrives at the end and sees the painted faces, the spears, the fire, there's a flicker of disbelief. From his perspective, it's absurd. Children playing savage. But we know it wasn't play. That disconnect matters. Outsiders always underestimate internal collapse. Societies can look functional from a distance while rotting from inside. The island looked like paradise from the sky. Up close, it was fracture. The film's lasting power comes from that duality. Surface calm, internal volatility. And here's the deepest layer. The boys cry not just because they're rescued, but because they're forced to re-enter accountability. Authority returns. Judgment returns. Consequences return. Consequences return. The island allowed experimentation without oversight. That freedom is intoxicating until it isn't. In many ways, the ending suggests something almost tragic. The boys needed supervision to remain humane. Their morality wasn't self-sustaining. That realization hits hardest when you stop viewing them as children and start viewing them as prototypes of adults. Because adulthood doesn't magically remove the beast, it just teaches it better camouflage. Look at war. Look at political polarization. Look at tribal identity movements. Look at corporate power struggles. The island is everywhere. Different uniforms. Same impulses. And that's why this 1990 version, even if not universally praised, remains relevant. It may simplify certain ambiguities, but it makes the emotional mechanics accessible. It shows how quickly cohesion can fracture when fear, pride, and power intersect. So what ultimately defines this film? Not its budget, not its critical score, not even its faithfulness to Golding. It's defined by the discomfort it leaves behind. You finish it and feel unsettled, not because boys became violent, but because you recognize the blueprint. Remove oversight. Add fear. Introduce competition. Watch alignment shift. That formula doesn't belong to fiction. It belongs to history. And maybe the most haunting realization is this. The island didn't create the beast. It just removed the adults who were pretending it wasn't there. So the final question lingers. Not about Ralph, not about Jack, not about Simon, but about us. If structure weakens, if fear rises, if someone offers strength over fairness, which fire do we gather around? Let's strip this down to something even more intimate. Forget politics. Forget philosophy. Forget allegory. At its most raw level, Lord of the Flies is about permission. The moment the boys realize there are no adults coming immediately, something subtle shifts. At first, it's small-talking over one another, ignoring minor rules, skipping assigned duties. But every unpunished act becomes precedent. Permission expands. And what makes the 1990 version quietly effective is how gradual that expansion feels. There isn't a single dramatic snap where civilization vanishes. There's a slow acclimation to fewer consequences. The absence of correction becomes normal. That's how erosion works in real life too. No one wakes up intending to dismantle order. They test it, bend it, see what happens. When nothing happens, when there's no accountability, the line moves. Jack understands this instinctively. He doesn't overthrow Ralph in one bold move. He chips away, undermines, questions, reframes failure as weakness, reframes caution as cowardice, reframes democracy as inefficiency. Language shifts first. Behavior follows. And then something fascinating happens. The boys begin to enjoy the shift. This is the part that makes audiences uncomfortable. Because it's not just fear driving the tribe, it's exhilaration. The painted faces aren't worn reluctantly. They're embraced. The chanting isn't forced. It's ecstatic. There's freedom in abandoning restraint. Freedom from expectation. Freedom from hierarchy. Freedom from self-control. And freedom without discipline can feel intoxicating. That's the true temptation on the island, not survival, but release. Ralph clings to responsibility. Jack offers release. One demands effort. The other promises energy. In moments of crisis, energy wins. Now let's examine something even deeper. Visibility. When the boys are in uniform, they're identifiable, individual, accountable. Once they paint their faces, identity dissolves. It's harder to distinguish who did what. The tribe becomes a blur of movement and color. Anonymity shifts behavior. This is psychological fact. Remove visibility and inhibition drops. The 1990 film doesn't lecture about this. It shows it. The boys' posture changes when masked. Movements grow larger, voices louder, risk increases. Paint becomes armor against guilt, which means the island doesn't just test morality, it tests identity stability. Who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when everyone is chanting? Who are you when your face is hidden? That's why the ending devastates. The officer's arrival forces visibility back onto them. The paint becomes shame instead of power. They are seen again, not as tribe, but as children. And the emotional collapse suggests something critical. The beast was never fully embraced. It was indulged. There's a difference. Indulgence requires opportunity. Nature requires inevitability. The film leans toward indulgence. These boys weren't destined for brutality. They were permitted it. And that nuance matters. Because if brutality is inevitable, there's no responsibility. If brutality is permitted, responsibility returns. The 1990 adaptation, despite its streamlined storytelling, preserves that moral weight. It may sharpen Jack into clearer opposition. It may simplify certain ambiguities. But it never absolves the group. Every boy who joins the chant chooses to join. Peer pressure explains behavior. It does not erase agency. And maybe that's the final, quiet horror. Not that evil overwhelms, not that systems fail, but that most collapses happen through ordinary decisions made in sequence. A look away, a nervous laugh, a step closer to power, a step away from principle. No thunder, no prophecy, no monster in the trees, just accumulation, which makes the story timeless. Because islands change, uniforms change, uniforms change, generations change. But the mechanism remains disturbingly consistent. Remove oversight. Introduce fear. Offer belonging. Reward aggression. Normalize excess. Delay accountability. Watch identity bend. And so we circle back to the question that has been echoing since the first assembly on that sunlit beach. Civilization isn't a structure we build once. It's a structure we maintain daily. The conch only works if we keep picking it up. And the moment we stop, the island begins again.